Well, Prime Minister Mark Carney is meeting with Chinese leaders and officials in Beijing today.
Prime Minister Mark Carney is in China, the first visit by a Canadian Prime Minister in nearly a decade, and day one featured several cooperation agreements signed.
The moment Mark Carney stepped off the plane in Beijing on January 13th, it marked a shift Canada had avoided for nearly a decade. This was the first visit by a Canadian Prime Minister to China in 8 years, ending a long period of frozen diplomacy, stalled trade, and rising domestic pressure. Behind closed doors, Carney met with President Xi Jinping, Premier Li Qiang, and senior Chinese business leaders, reopening conversations that had once become politically untouchable. For years, billions of dollars in trade were trapped behind tariffs and retaliation, leaving Canadian farmers, exporters, and entire industries absorbing the fallout. Now, Ottawa is trying to break that deadlock while reshaping Canada's economic future. The government has set an ambitious goal to double non-U.S. exports over the next decade, and this visit could determine whether that strategy is realistic or dangerously risky. Talks are circling electric vehicle tariffs, punitive duties on canola, seafood, and pork, and renewed access to markets for oil, natural gas, agriculture, and critical minerals that were largely shut down under the previous government. With global trade lines shifting rapidly, the question is unavoidable. Did tariff turmoil force Canada to look east again? And what risks come with rebuilding a relationship strained for nearly 10 years? For much of that decade, silence defined the relationship. 8 years passed without a Canadian Prime Minister visiting China, and in global politics, such absence is rarely accidental. The last visit occurred in December 2017 when Justin Trudeau traveled to Beijing during a period that now feels distant and unrecognizable. What followed was a gradual collapse of trust, cooperation, and economic exchange. The breaking point came in 2018, when Canada arrested Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou at the request of the United States. China responded by detaining 2 Canadian citizens, holding them for more than 1,000 days. That episode hardened public opinion, froze political dialogue, and pushed relations into deep freeze. Economic retaliation followed years later with even greater force. In October 2024, Canada imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, aligning closely with Washington's policy. Beijing retaliated swiftly, placing 100% tariffs on Canadian canola oil and meal, 75.8% on canola seed, and 25% on seafood and pork. A once deeply integrated trade relationship fractured almost overnight, and Canadian producers paid the price. The economic damage was not theoretical. Saskatchewan's canola exports to China collapsed to just $96 million in August 2025, a staggering 76% decline compared to the same month the year before. Manitoba's pork industry reported $19 million in annual losses, numbers that echoed through rural communities already struggling with rising costs. For farmers, China was not a geopolitical abstraction. It was the second largest market for key exports, and losing it felt less like a policy disagreement and more like an economic shock. Supply chains built over decades vanished with no immediate replacement. While federal officials defended the tariffs as necessary alignment with American policy, the burden landed disproportionately on Western Canada, fueling frustration that national decisions were being made far from the communities absorbing the damage. Then the global environment shifted again. Donald Trump's return to the center of American politics brought renewed threats, not just of tariffs, but of economic warfare and even annexation rhetoric. When Trump openly threatened Canada with punitive measures and language that treated the country as an extension of American power rather than a sovereign partner, the risks of overdependence became impossible to ignore. Carney recognized that retaliation alone would not protect Canada's economy. Tariffs piled on tariffs only deepened losses, and relying on Washington for stability no longer felt safe. Canada needed alternatives capable of absorbing shocks and creating leverage. That reality forced China back into focus. As the world's second-largest economy, China remained the only market large enough to realistically offset American pressure. The choice was uncomfortable, but increasingly unavoidable. The reset began quietly in October 2025 at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in South Korea, where Carney met President Xi Jinping for the first leader-level contact since 2017. No sweeping agreements emerged, but the tone changed. Carney later described the meeting as a turning point, reopening dialogue after years of silence. Xi extended a formal invitation to visit China, signaling Beijing's willingness to rebuild ties as part of a broader strategy to secure resources, diversify partners, and reduce vulnerability to U.S. trade pressure. That invitation became reality when Carney landed in Beijing, stepping into meetings designed to restart a relationship that once moved billions of dollars in trade. Despite years of strain, the economic foundation remains substantial. China is still Canada's second-largest trading partner after the United States. two-way merchandise trade reached $118.7 billion in 2024, with Canadian exports at $29.9 billion. Yet those figures understate what once existed. Before tariffs and political freezes, China imported massive volumes of Canadian canola, pork, and seafood. Energy companies explored LNG projects aimed at Chinese demand, while Chinese investment flowed into Canadian mining and infrastructure. When tensions escalated, that momentum stopped abruptly. Projects stalled, capital retreated, and trade shrank, leaving both sides worse off. Carney's strategy rests on a simple reality. China needs what Canada produces, and Canada needs markets beyond the United States. Oil, natural gas, critical minerals, agriculture, and timber sit at the core of China's long-term planning as it seeks stable suppliers outside volatile regions. Canada offers a resource-rich economy governed by rule of law and predictable contracts. China offers scale, a market capable of absorbing exports without the political volatility now associated with Washington. Carney frames this not as an ideological shift, but as strategic autonomy, reducing dependence on a single partner that has shown a willingness to weaponize trade. At the heart of the Beijing visit is a proposed trade reset. Chinese officials have indicated that if Canada removes the 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, Beijing is prepared to lift punitive duties on Canadian canola, pork, and seafood. Bloomberg reports that this proposal is central to discussions. The trade-off is clear. Farmers regain access to a critical market, stabilizing prices and restoring revenue. Prairie agriculture receives relief from policies that hit western provinces hardest. Manitoba pork producers recover millions in losses, while seafood exporters regain premium buyers. In exchange, Canada allows Chinese electric vehicles into its market, a move that has sparked domestic debate. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has opposed removing the tariff, citing protection of the province's auto sector. Prairie premiers argue the current policy creates a two-front trade war that leaves Western Canada carrying an unfair burden. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinnew has warned that the strategy pits regions against each other while delivering few benefits. Carney understands the political math. Agriculture affects more ridings than EV manufacturing, and the losses are immediate and measurable. The risks are real, but so is the cost of doing nothing. Energy has already begun reshaping the relationship. Since the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion came online in mid-2024, Canadian crude exports to Asia, including China, have surged. In the first 3 quarters of 2025, petroleum exports to China jumped more than 240%. With capacity of 590,000 barrels per day, Trans Mountain allows tankers to deliver heavy crude directly to Chinese refineries. This shift accelerated when the United States seized Venezuelan oil, cutting off China's largest heavy crude supplier. Canadian oil filled that gap, and once refineries adjust, switching suppliers becomes costly, locking in long-term demand. Natural gas represents the next frontier. Canada holds the world's 4th largest reserves, while China seeks to reduce coal dependence. LNG projects targeting Asian markets are under discussion, and the strategic value is enormous. Energy infrastructure creates decades-long trade patterns. Carney's broader goal is to double non-U.S. exports from roughly 25% to 50% over 10 years. Progress is visible. Exports to the UK, EU, China, Singapore, and Indonesia rose through 2025. Aerospace exports to Singapore climbed 67%, while the government committed $159 million to trade financing programs supporting diversification. This marks a structural shift. For decades, roughly 75% of Canadian exports flowed to the United States, a concentration that once felt safe. Trump shattered that assumption by turning trade into a weapon. Canada now seeks alternatives that cannot be shut down by a single political decision. China, facing massive U.S. tariffs itself, also needs partners. Canada offers stability and resources aligned with Chinese demand. Chinese state media has welcomed the reset. Officials describe Carney's visit as a new starting point. For Beijing, Canada represents both resources and a signal to other U.S. allies that alignment with Washington is not automatic. Australia has already reset ties after years of trade restrictions. The UK is preparing its own engagement. A Canadian pivot would reinforce that trend. The risks remain real. China has a record of using economic leverage, and human rights concerns persist. Carney's strategy is not abandonment of values, but balance. Canada is not replacing the United States with China, it is creating options. By building multiple strong relationships, Canada reduces the ability of any single partner to dominate its decisions. Trump's reaction is predictable. Engagement with China will be framed as betrayal, possibly followed by threats. Yet that response highlights the logic of diversification. Alternatives reduce vulnerability and increase leverage. The Beijing visit signals a broader shift. Canada is no longer relying on automatic alignment. In a harsher global environment, it is asserting independence and pursuing relationships that serve its national interest, even when they diverge from American expectations.